Okay, the bleak facts obviously point for a need for creative approaches, and so the next speaker is known for this. It's Kate Raworth. She is a visiting fellow at Oxford, and she has co-authored the UNDP Human Development Reports that we use. We all want, as researchers, to be known for concepts or ideas that we come up with. She has come up with the concept of a doughnut of planetary and social boundaries. So now she's coming to ask us to imagine a new type of economy for the 21st century. Please.
To join you this way. Can you hear me clearly? Great. So I'm going to talk about a donut and whether or not we can do business in this donut. So let me take a very, very big picture. Let's stand back and look at the long view on the second slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is 100,000 years of the planet's history. And what you can see on this slide are two things. We've got the temperature over that time. What you can see is the temperature of the planet has varied greatly over the last 100,000 years. But in the last 10 to 12,000 years, it's been remarkably stable. And this is the geological era known as the Holocene. It's the era that's given rise to all of human civilization, and it's the era in which humanity began to practice agriculture because of the stability of the climate. So this is a pretty unique era of history for humanity, and it's what prompted Johan Rockström and other Earth system scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Center to ask, what is it about the Holocene that makes it so benevolent to humanity? And they came up with 9 critical Earth system boundaries that keep humanity in the Holocene. If we look at the third slide, we can see those 9 critical boundaries. I'll start at the top. Climate change, which the previous speaker was just talking about. We need to ensure that greenhouse gases don't push us over that 2-degree mark, push us out of that safe space. But also, we've got fresh water use, ensuring that we don't withdraw so much water from the Earth's rivers and lakes and dam them so much that we actually transform the hydrological cycle. Thirdly, we've got to ensure that we don't add so much nitrogen and phosphorus into the Earth's rivers that through agricultural fertilizer use, that it leaches out into the oceans and lakes, causing eutrophication of those systems, causing dead zones in the oceans, killing off coral reefs, killing off sea life. Fourthly, we need to ensure that, sorry, I can't see clearly enough. We need to ensure, I'm sorry, I can't see the slide clearly enough. What's the fourth one? No, sorry, back to the previous slide. We need to ensure chemical pollution, ocean acidification. I'm sorry, I can see it now. Ocean acidification, that carbon dioxide emissions going into the oceans are acidifying the oceans, again, killing off coral reefs and ocean life. Next, we need to ensure chemical pollution is not so extreme, whether it's nuclear waste, persistent organic pollutants, plastics, all sorts of chemicals that we're adding into the Earth's life systems that we don't actually fully understand how they interact with life support systems. Atmospheric aerosol loading, so we're putting particulates up into the atmosphere that are actually transforming monsoon patterns, changing where clouds form and where rain falls across the world's continents. Next, the ozone layer, ensuring that we're not putting so many CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, into the atmosphere, that we are creating this hole in the ozone layer. And of course, the Montreal Protocol in 1995 was a critical international agreement to start closing that hole up again. So we know we can come back within these boundaries if we use our collective intelligence to do so. Next, sorry, not the next slide, the next boundary. Biodiversity loss. So this picture shows us tropical forest on one side and monoculture agriculture on the other side. And if we lose the biodiversity of the world, we are losing the very fabric of life. And of course, reducing the Earth's resilience to change. And resilience is a critical feature of staying within this stable space. And lastly, land use change. If we transform the context of the land surface, changing it from its original cover, again, we're reducing the Earth's resilience. So these 9 critical Earth system processes are what Johan Rockström and the other Earth system scientists claim are the critical boundaries for keeping us in a safe operating space for humanity. And then they said, well, where are we in relation to these 9 boundaries today? If we look on the next slide, we are over at least 3 of these boundaries. We know we're over the boundary for climate change. Here they set the boundary at around 350 parts per million. Today we're over 400 parts per million. But we're also over on nitrogen use. They claim we're at least 3 times using 3 times more nitrogen, putting it out into the atmosphere than is sustainable. And we're massively over on biodiversity loss, 10 times over what they think is a sustainable rate of biodiversity loss. And even on those other boundaries that are within the circle, trends show that we're moving further and further out. So we're moving towards the edge of the boundaries. Now, the immediate response might be, well, we want to be at that space right in the middle of the circle, the safe space, where humanity is putting no pressure on the planet at all. But there are 7 billion people alive today. And in the future, we're going to be at least 9 billion. And we know we need to use resources to meet our human rights. So actually, we need to put pressure on this planet for humanity to survive. It's a balance that we need to strike. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the critical dimensions in which we need to use resources to meet our human rights. The right to food, to health, to water, to income, to have education, to be resilient, to have a job, to have voice, to have access to energy with social equity and gender equality. And these 11 dimensions are the 11 top social priorities that were stated by the world's governments in the Rio+20 conference last year. So we actually want to be out of this space of deprivation in the middle. And we want to ensure every human being has the access to resources to meet their human rights. If we put these 2 pictures together on the next slide, we get a donut-shaped space. It's not a circle anymore, it's a donut, because we want to ensure that all of us, all 7 billion alive today, 9 billion in the future, are out of that space in the middle, which is a space of deprivation. We each have the resources we need to get over that circle, over the social foundation. But we need to do that for all 9 billion of us in the future within those environmental boundaries. So it's that green space that we need to live in. It's a balance between enough resource use for the rights of all, but within the planet's boundaries. And to me, this donut picture is a very, very simple but powerful representation of what the 21st century challenge is all about. If we could be the generation that started bringing humanity into this safe and just space, we will be the turnaround generation, making up for the terrible pathway that we've been on to date. And then we can ask ourselves, well, where are we right now in terms of humanity's position in that social foundation? And the next slide shows it. We can see that for all dimensions for which we have internationally available data, humanity is well below that boundary. So if you look at the boundary on food, that blue segment represents the 13% of people in the world who don't have enough food to eat. On energy, 19% of people in the world still don't have access to electricity. If everybody in the world had the resources they need to meet their human rights, that entire circle would be orange. So we can see there's a great deal of deprivation in the most basic areas still today. And when we put these 2 diagrams together in the next slide, you can see we are simultaneously way over critical planetary boundaries, while a large proportion of humanity have not even met their basic needs. And to me, these 2 pictures together are an indictment of the development pathway that we've followed to date. The challenge is, how do we move into that donut space from both sides? And of course, we have to move into both sides together, because the social challenge and the environmental challenge are tightly intertwined. The next slide. Imagine if the world's governments, okay, this isn't actually the world's governments, I admit, this isn't the United Nations, but imagine if the world's governments were sitting around a table that looked like this. Wouldn't that change the way they negotiated? Wouldn't that enable governments to get beyond the short-term national self-interest and think about long-term collective common interest? On the next slide, what if the world's companies, and this is where we are today, this is the point of your conference, what if the world's companies actually sat around a table like this? Well, some companies are choosing to sit around this table. I've worked with several companies that have used this as a frame for thinking about their own corporate strategy. And if they want to be a socially responsible and environmentally responsible company, they've said to me, this is a very useful frame because it brings into one diagram, all of the different social and environmental dimensions that we need to be thinking about. On the next slide, one of the companies I've worked with is Sainsbury's, which is one of the 4 major supermarkets in the UK. They recently invited me to talk to all their meat, fish, and poultry suppliers to help them reframe their supply chain to bring it into this safe and just space, especially on the environmental impacts of meat production. It's fantastic that progressive companies are doing this. But of course, we don't want to rely on the benevolence and the presence of progressive corporate leaders. What if they get ousted by the board? Then where would we be left? So the trick, the magic, is going to be to shift this from a voluntary act to something that's integrated into the way companies have to be run. If we go to the next slide, this is an image of a shareholder meeting of one of the largest consumer companies in the world, in America. These shareholders, of course, and many of them represent the pension companies we come from, they want a good return for their money. How could we transform the discourse and the interests at that meeting so that it looks more like the next slide? That those shareholders are actually being told about the safe and just space, and that this company is reporting to them, not only in terms of the share price, but in terms of its stakeholder impact of bringing us into the safe and just space. That's my question, and I'm very excited about the research that you're doing and the discussions you're going to have over the next couple of days. And just to go to the last slide, if we can find ways that help businesses choose to move into the donut, but more importantly, require business to be conducted in the donut, we will be going a long way towards creating ourselves as that turnaround generation. And I really look forward to hearing the ideas you come out with. I shall be incorporating them into future presentations that I'm doing. Thank you very much.